Welcome to Soft Serve Science, where you can get the scoop on the science of us. My name is Lily. I have a bachelor's in sociology.
My name is Eliza. I have a master's in clinical psychology.
We read excerpts. We are not experts. So, what's the scoop?
This episode is about the lobotomy.
Oh!
You may be asking yourself, what is a lobotomy?
What is a lobotomy? I'll ask you instead.
Great, because I researched this. It's using a sharp instrument, or other methods, but historically usually a sharp instrument, to sever the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus. Now you're going to ask me, what's the prefrontal cortex? What is the thalamus?
What if I ask, what is the thalamus? What is the prefrontal cortex?
Alright, I can play your game. The thalamus does a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff. Think of something that your brain does.
Tells me to eat chips.
That's in the thalamus. Great. The thalamus is a central relay system of the brain. It involves voluntary movement, multisensory integration, learning, memory, emotion, fear, and reward responses, excitatory and inhibitory neurons, your sleep-wake cycle, and the list goes on and on and on. The thalamus is basically like a switchboard for your brain. It connects things, it integrates things, and it's very important for your general functioning. You could lose other areas of your brain and still be okay, but you cannot lose your thalamus and still be a functioning, independent human being. And that is why it is in one of the most protected parts of your brain, right at the top of your spinal cord. You can think of this as a quick rule that the more protected something is in your brain, the more important it is.
So the prefrontal cortex sounds like it isn't very important, all things considered.
A lot of animals don't have prefrontal cortexes, or they don't have very big prefrontal cortexes. It is something that makes us distinctly human. Our ability to self-regulate, plan, make decisions, follow multiple steps in a sequence, focus, and create long-term goals for ourselves, things that set us apart from the intelligence of other animals, those exist often in the prefrontal cortex. Although, as an aside here, the whole idea that certain things exist in certain areas of the brain is a rudimentary theory at best, because your brain does a lot of different things in a lot of different areas. So to say that the thalamus only does your sleep-wake cycle is not true. But It is very important in those processes. Another distinction between the thalamus and the prefrontal cortex is the thalamus is one of the first brain structures to develop, and the prefrontal cortex is one of the last brain structures to develop completely. It's kind of a pop psychology thing that's well known that your prefrontal cortex doesn't finish developing until you're around 25 years old. The prefrontal cortex is at the front of your brain, right behind your forehead, and the thalamus is in the very center of your brain. What do you know about lobotomies?
I know that I can't remember the professor's name. I know that he showed us a video of one in Psych 1, and I looked down instead of at the screen.
I didn't watch that video either. There were several videos when I was researching this topic that wanted to show me video of a lobotomy happening, and I was like, nope, not for me. So yeah, you remember it as a gruesome, horrific process.
Yes. Traumatic to patient and viewer alike.
The lobotomy was invented because they were doing a lot of experiments with the mentally ill around the turn of the 20th century, because there was an increase in people needing to stay in mental health asylums around that time, which is not really devoid of historical context. As you and I have discussed before, mental illness, or the notion thereof, is just someone who struggles to exist in a certain historical context or in a society. So you can imagine, as industrialization really takes off, more and more people have a difficult time following along with that kind of idea of what makes a successful, functioning adult. And so people get institutionalized. So asylums are at their breaking point. They're all full. The American people are building more. And doctors are maybe with good intentions, often not trying out different experiments on how to cure mental illness. One of these experiments was called malaria therapy, where they would deliberately inject someone with malaria.
What?
Maybe that could be the topic for a future episode.
Oh my goodness.
One was called deep sleep therapy, where they would put someone in a medical coma for weeks to months, and that was, to them, better than the person being psychotic or neurotic. One was electroshock therapy, which still happens. It was invented around this time. And then there's the lobotomy. What year do you think the first lobotomy took place?
1927.
Okay, it's a trick question. It's debated among scholars. So I'm going to give you some facts, and then once I'm done with the facts, you can tell me which one of these experiments was the first lobotomy.
The first intentional lobotomy?
The first psychosurgery that we know of happened in 1888 by the Swiss doctor Gottlieb Burckhardt. He operated on 6 patients, removing sections of their cerebral cortex. He claimed a 50% success rate. 2 of the patients were quieter than before, and 1 he said that he cured of mental illness completely. And 1 of them died, but, he didn't stress that part of his research. Even though he claimed a 50% success rate, there was a large negative reception by the medical community, and that halted further experiments for decades.
I would imagine if 1/6 of your patients died from a procedure, the medical community should be upset.
You would imagine, but the history gets more gruesome as we go on. As I was researching this, I couldn't help but think that there was a villain in this story, which is interesting because in our other topics, when we later discuss other historical, sociological, or psychological interesting facts, there are people who are doing their best and maybe were made errors in judgment. But in this story, there's definitely a villain, and by the end of the story, I want you to figure out who it is.
Okay, a mystery.
So here's our first candidate, Gottlieb Burckhardt. The next person to experiment with psychosurgery, his name was Walter Dandy.
Walter Dandy.
I know, he's got like a really fun name for somebody who did human experiments.
I think if you do gruesome human experiments, you should have to change your name to something evil.
Walter Dandy completed the first bilateral lobectomy of a human in 1930. He removed the entire frontal lobe. Do you think that would kill someone? It didn't. The person lived, the subject, but they experienced blunted speech and emotion, but they were still functionally intelligent, or described as functionally intelligent, even without their frontal lobe.
And the frontal lobe, as compared to the prefrontal cortex?
The prefrontal cortex is a part of the frontal lobe.
Great, thank you. Man, just took the whole thing out?
You gotta remember this was 1930, and there were a bunch of horrific human rights abuses in medicine and psychology at the time, which we will get to more in later episodes.
Oh, yes, we will.
So this was something that had been hypothesized by many doctors to be effective, but most doctors were too apprehensive to actually experiment with the removal of the frontal lobe. But Walter Dandy is a maverick, and he did it. And the person didn't die, and to the medical community, that was good enough. The next advancement in the experimentation of psychosurgery was a man named John Fulton removed frontal lobes from 2 chimpanzees in 1935. I knew you would like this part, so I recorded the chimpanzees' names. Their names were Lucy and Becky.
Oh, Lucy and Becky.
Becky, in particular, would have these tantrums when she was with Lucy in these medical experiments, and she was not rewarded for her efforts. She would have these tantrums. She would basically roll around on the ground and poop everywhere.
As one does.
As one does. So, he removed Lucy and Becky's frontal lobe. It decreased their tantrums and resulted in serenity and calmness, and the difference was especially apparent for Becky. Becky was described as joining a happiness cult.
Joining a happiness cult?
She was no longer irritable, no longer having tantrums. She was calm. However, these chimpanzees were now no longer able to complete their experimental tasks. They were no longer able to plan or make decisions or follow multi-step solutions. So he basically retired them from his experiments in this action. But because they didn't die, the medical community was like, oh, very nice. Lovely chimpanzees. This took place in London. That's my British accent.
It's great.
Thank you. One doctor was there, and he raised his hand, I assume. The story goes that he asked if this could be performed on humans in order to help humans that were having tantrums, being difficult, hard to manage. And John Fulton was horrified. The word that most people used to describe his countenance was shocked. This gentleman that asked Mr. Fulton the question was named Antonio Egas Moniz. He was a Portuguese doctor and the inventor of the leucotomy, what would later become the lobotomy. In November 12th, 1935, he performed the first leucotomy. He came up with the idea from seeing veterans of World War I who had frontal lobe injuries and seeing how they were calm and not very smart. And he thought that removing the connection between the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobe, and the rest of the brain would result in the same calmness in his mentally ill patients who were experiencing psychosis, paranoia, they were irrational, word salad, they were having a bad time.
I see. So the trade-off for calm and losing those negative side effects and symptoms is some of your intelligence and personality.
Right. Which was a trade-off that many doctors were willing to make on behalf of the patients they treated.
I see.
He initially, for the first couple of experiments, he drilled 2 holes in the side of the skull and injected pure alcohol in order to kill the neurons that connected the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain. As you can imagine, this spread throughout the brain and resulted in a lot of cells dying, not just the ones he was seeking to kill off.
Oh my goodness. He had to have known that would happen.
I mean, he was trying to destroy cells in the brain. That was his goal. He just destroyed too many. It was not precise enough.
Of course not.
So this was not a very effective method. It was extremely damaging to multiple different brain areas, and it was dangerous for the life and safety of his patients. So his new method was to use a long metal stick that he developed called the leucotome, and he would put that into the 2 holes on the side of the forehead and just wiggle it around to disrupt the connections in the brain area that he wanted to disrupt. He initially experimented on 20 different people. I believe the first several of them had the alcohol method, and then the rest of them had the leucotome method. He claimed that 35% of them greatly improved, 35% somewhat improved, and 30% were unchanged, with no negative side effects, no people being worse off as a result of the psychosurgery.
How could that be? How many of them survived?
All 20 of them survived.
Wow.
This was his opinion. This was not supported by the evidence that he had. The asylum director who let him use 20 of his patients reported that the patients returned, quote, diminished and experienced a, quote, degradation of personality. Despite this, Moniz insisted that the leucotomy was, quote, always safe. The idea was that the disrupting of the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain would not be permanent, that the brain would repair itself and it would reset those circuits, and the mentally ill person would no longer have the repetitive or damaging thought patterns that resulted in the symptoms of their mental illness.
So they discovered going in there, cutting connections physically before discovering, like, DBT?
Yes. At this time, therapy was still in its infancy.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, therapy really hit its stride in like the 60s.
We'll have to talk about Freud in a later episode.
Oh, we will. Yeah. For this, Antonio Moniz earned the Nobel Prize in Medicine.
Oh, no!
In 1949. And even though the international community has called on the Nobel Prize Foundation to rescind the award, the Nobel Prize Foundation refuses to rescind it. It still belongs to him, even though he's long dead. So if you go on the website for the Nobel Prize, that's the award for medicine in 1949.
I wonder how often they rescind prizes.
That would be interesting, yeah. Our story then shifts to American doctors Walter Freeman and James Watts. They were the people that developed the lobotomy procedure. They were at first performing leucotomies as early as 1936, the year after Moniz invented them. But they wanted the leucotomy to be more accessible because as it was, in order to perform a leucotomy, you needed to have a sterile operating room, you needed to have anesthesia, you needed to have several attendants, and you needed to have extensive training. So it wasn't as readily accessible to meet the needs of the growing population of people who were considered mentally ill. So Freeman and Watts think that the skull is thinner behind the eyeballs than it is on the sides of the head.
Isn't there no skull behind the eyeballs?
There's a little bit of skull. When I was researching this topic, I saw a video with a real human skull that demonstrated how this would work, and there is a little bit of skull right above your eyeball.
Oh, that's interesting.
But it's very thin. And actually in the video, the piece of skull right there was broken, not from a lobotomy, just from wear and tear.
Okay.
So Freeman and Watts start to practice on cadavers through their eye sockets with a common ice pick. This is where the term ice pick lobotomy comes around. They also practiced on watermelons and grapefruits.
Watermelons and grapefruits?
Yes.
Wow, they did surgery on a grape.
They practiced brain surgery on a fruit that does not have a brain.
Amazing.
And with their new method, which they rebranded as the lobotomy, they didn't need surgical rooms, they didn't need medical licenses, although they had them, they didn't need years of training, didn't need anesthesia, the patient could be awake, and it could be more easily accessible throughout the country and the world.
The longer that sentence went on, the more terrifying that got.
Now, everybody thinks of it as an ice pick lobotomy, right? They never used an ice pick on a person. They only used ice picks on cadavers and unfortunate grapefruits. What they did is they invented the orbitoclast, which is, again, a long, thin metal stick, and a simple hammer. And that's what they would use to perform the lobotomy. The lobotomy is stupidly simple. You go 5 centimeters deep in the brain, behind the eyeball. You turn 45 degrees. You go 2 more centimeters, and then you turn again. And then you kind of just go back and forth like a windshield wiper. Then you take that stick out, you go into the other eyeball, and you do it over again. It takes 10 minutes.
Oh, just the thought of something cracking through my newly discovered eye bones is horrifying.
It is horrifying, and this is why Watts left the practice. So now it was just Freeman. Freeman and Watts did a bunch of leucotomies together, but once they developed the lobotomy, Watts was horrified that it was now so simple and so unskilled and so unscientific that he left the practice of lobotomies and leucotomies forever. Freeman, however, to his death, insisted that the lobotomy was safe and helpful for patients. This is where the lobotomy as we know it comes from. The first transorbital lobotomy was done on a human patient in 1946.
That's not too long ago. I wonder what the life expectancy for a lobotomy patient would be, and if it would be possible to currently talk to someone.
If they can talk.
If they can talk.
Yeah, it's definitely possible that some of these people are still alive. The lobotomy was performed on people with a variety of mild to severe mental health problems.
Mild?
Yes, it was performed on people who had depression for a couple of months
A couple of months?
As well as performed on people who had severe, what we would call schizophrenia, their whole lives. It didn't matter. Freeman insisted that everyone would benefit from a lobotomy.
Oh my goodness.
Freeman called it surgically induced childhood.
Surgically induced childhood.
And he performed lobotomies all the way until 1967 when the government intervened after he killed a patient. Which is weird because 5 to 15% of patients that underwent a lobotomy died immediately during the procedure or in the days following. So I don't know what happened in 1967 that made the US government say, okay, enough of these, but that was his last lobotomy, and I believe he died in the 80s. Still insisting that lobotomies were safe and effective.
1967. So, the first one you said was 1947?
The first leucotomy was in 1935. The first transorbital lobotomy was in 1946. And the last one performed by Freeman was in 1967. France was doing lobotomies until the 80s.
Oh my goodness.
Lobotomies were known to reduce the complexity of psychic life. That's a quote from a man named Maurice Partridge. The best outcome was a loss of previous personality traits, someone becoming simple-minded, decreased cognition, detachment from others, and confusion. The worst outcome is people who were described as a shell of their former selves, seizures, catatonia, loss of language, loss of continence, suicide, and death.
So even the best outcome was not great.
Right. And this is my opinion here, I don't think anyone ever benefited from a lobotomy.
I can't imagine how they would.
And this was something that was criticized by doctors during the time. One of the criticisms was, how can you damage a part of the body in order to fix it? So it doesn't make sense.
It really doesn't.
But there were a lot of lobotomies. There were around 70,000 lobotomies performed worldwide, mostly in America, Europe, and parts of Asia. 20,000 of those were in the US of A, and many done by Freeman himself. He would perform as many as 12 or 15 lobotomies a day. Sometimes he would do 2 at one time.
2 at a time? How can he do 2 at a time? Do you think he washed his hands between?
I mean, he was a doctor, but I don't know. I didn't find any data on whether or not he washed his hands between lobotomies. The lobotomy does not exist without context. It is related, of course, to sexism and the eugenics movement.
Of course.
In 1952, Freeman operated on, quote, 20 very dangerous Negroes, end quote, and was happy to come back a week later and find them all sitting under a tree in happy idiocy.
Oh my goodness.
Freeman often said that the black woman was the best candidate for a lobotomy.
Oh man.
And 60% of lobotomies were done on women because their mental health symptoms, their eccentricities, their violence were less acceptable.
Hysteria.
Yeah, it was still called hysteria at the beginning of this story.
I might become hysterical over this one.
I get it. Freeman also said that lobotomies were more successful at returning a woman to domesticity than at returning a man to a career.
Well, of course, how can you have a career when you can't think?
And that's propaganda on his part. Lobotomies were very rarely actually successful.
How can you run a home without being able to think clearly?
Exactly. To be honest, it was just to make people easier to deal with. They still would have to be institutionalized.
Yeah, how could they care for themselves?
In 1948, a critic of the practice named Robert Werner said, "It makes the custodial care of many patients easier. Let me remark in passing that killing them makes their custodial care still easier."
Dang.
It gets worse. Many of the frequent demographic groups to have lobotomies suggested for them were gay men and women, or what were then called transsexuals, as a cure.
Oh, man. So far, in this segment, you've listed, I believe, 3 reasons they would have given me one. Could have had 6 lobotomies by now.
And people did get lobotomies more than once.
More than once?
Not as often, but I did read stories of people who were lobotomized more than once.
Would it just not take?
Just weren't satisfied with the outcome, I guess. Probably whoever was in charge of caring for them wasn't satisfied with the outcome. Because women often would not choose to have a lobotomy happen to them, or they would not be given the full information for what was happening to them. There were many stories I read of husbands having their wives lobotomized, or fathers having their daughters lobotomized.
Oh, man.
The first country to ban the lobotomy was the USSR. It was banned in 1950. Officials there called it contrary to the principles of humanity, and one critic said, "Through lobotomy, an insane person is changed to an idiot." The lobotomy fell out of favor in the mid-20th century as more stories of the horrific after effects became readily apparent, and as drugs such as Thorazine entered the market.
Thorazine.
I'm going to read you some case studies of people that underwent lobotomies so you could hear more about the stories of who they were before and after.
Yeah.
The first case study is a woman who was almost lobotomized. Her name is Lucia Fitzgerald. You might recognize that name because she is the co-founder of the first women's refuge in London for rape or domestic violence victims. It's called Women's Aid. It's still active. She is also a lesbian.
Yeah.
She saw a social worker for depression after a run-in with the police. She was homeless. And she was told that her lesbianism was the root of her problems. She went to see a doctor, and the doctor was asking her all these invasive questions about her sex and sexuality. And as a young girl, a teenager who had been raised Catholic, she felt very uncomfortable, and she physically fought him. She
Wow.
pinned him down to the desk, pinned him, restrained him, and ran out of there because she had a really bad feeling.
Yeah.
Later, in a bar, she met another lesbian who had been lobotomized. And this lesbian explained to her that she had memory issues, and Lucia was horrified at her loss of language. And then Lucia realized that that's what almost happened to her.
Wow.
So she was an activist on behalf of the lesbian community, so that way this wouldn't happen to more gay men and lesbians. She described the queer community as, quote, guinea pigs for lobotomies in the 50s and 60s.
We really have come so far in not a long amount of time.
And it wasn't easy. She physically fought off a man. She fought this man and pinned him to the desk and ran out of there. Wow. I've never had to fight anyone for my rights. Not physically.
Yeah. Wow.
We couldn't talk about the lobotomy without telling the story of Rosemary Kennedy, one of the most famous people to have ever undergone a lobotomy.
Oh, yeah.
Rosemary Kennedy was born in 1918 during the Spanish flu. Because the doctor was busy dealing with victims of the Spanish flu, there was only a nurse available when it was time for Rosemary to be born. The nurse gave Mrs. Kennedy some bad advice and told her to close her legs together so that way Rosemary could not be born until the doctor got there. Rosemary was stuck in the birth canal for 2 excruciating hours, deprived of oxygen.
2 hours without oxygen?
2 hours without oxygen.
And she survived that?
Yes, she did. Not without problems. She had developmental delays, and she never exceeded a 4th grade level.
Yeah, that makes sense. That oxygen deprivation can lead to all kinds of issues.
She was, even because of her developmental delays, she was denied Catholic communion. Kennedy's famously Catholic. Rosemary didn't get to be,
confirmation?
Rosemary didn't get to have a confirmation. She didn't get to participate in communion because of her disability.
That's so cruel.
Despite that, she was lively, energetic, beautiful, and charming. The Kennedys, ever the public figures, did everything that they could to hide Rosemary's disability from the public. When her father, Mr. Kennedy, was the British ambassador, Rosemary was presented to the king, and the British press went nuts because she was beautiful, and she became almost a celebrity. However, her father was a Nazi sympathizer, and in 1940, he had to resign from his post in disgrace. The Kennedys moved back to America and tried to find their futures there. Once back in America, Rosemary is described as regressing. Really, she was just acting out. She was running away at night. She was seen drinking. She was possibly embarrassing her father, which could not happen. And so, in 1941, he arranged for a lobotomy with Freeman and Watts without consulting Rosemary and without consulting his wife. They performed the lobotomy in November 1941. Rosemary was awake during the procedure, and they asked her to sing, so that way they could keep track of her mental faculties. When she suddenly went quiet, the procedure stopped, because they knew something had gone horribly wrong. Following her lobotomy, Rosemary was now unable to walk or speak under her own power, and she was incontinent, and she now needed to be institutionalized, which Kennedy Sr. did do. He hid Rosemary from the rest of the family and put her in an asylum in another state. For 20 years, John F. Kennedy, the president, didn't know where his sister Rosemary was.
That's horrible.
After Kennedy Sr. had passed away, the rest of the Kennedy family was able to reconnect with Rosemary, and they would bring her for family visits and vacations, and they had her around. She regained the ability to walk, but she never again spoke another word, not after the lobotomy in 1941. JFK, as president, funded research into mental health concerns, and his sister Eunice Kennedy founded what would later become the Special Olympics in honor of Rosemary's disabilities. Rosemary died surrounded by her family in 2005.
Wow.
I imagine there are still people out there who had a lobotomy performed on them because it was also done on minors and children.
Children?
Freeman did a lobotomy on a child as young as 4 years old.
You asked me earlier to find the villain in this story. I'm pretty sure it's Freeman. And probably also Rosemary's dad.
Readers at home? Readers. Listeners at home? Who do you think the villain of this story is? Or do you think that that's a silly question, that all these men were doing their best to help the mentally ill population? Time for Eliza's opinion. Lobotomies are cruel. And you would think they wouldn't be practiced anymore. Remember how I said the last one was done in France in 1980?
Yeah.
That was the last lobotomy. A type of psychosurgery called the bilateral cingulotomy was developed in 1947, and it is still accessible, even in the United States, for people who deal with severe OCD, major depression, or chronic pain that has not been treated by anything else. It is a last resort psychosurgery and is only given to people with very severe OCD. Unfortunately, it is only helpful for people with mild to moderate OCD. People with severe OCD who have a bilateral cingulotomy done to them do not get better often from this psychosurgery. It is done with an electrode or radiation, and what it does is it severs 1/2 inch of a connection between the prefrontal cortex and the cingulate gyrus.
So, a small lobotomy.
And a very precise one.
Very precise.
And this one was not given to people with mild depression. This is given to people who have been trying for years and years and years to help with their severe OCD. And they have a last resort, and they know all the risks. They give their permission for this procedure. It is much safer, and it still occurs.
That's interesting.
It was developed in 1947 by John Farquhar Fulton as a response to the lobotomy. So, Lily, how would you like to recap what you learned today?
Right. What I learned today is that the lobotomy is a much more complicated procedure than I had originally realized. I had figured its history was rather sexist, but I didn't realize it would also have such a strong root in racism and homophobia. And now I have some names to those faces of the evil scientists at work. Sure, they say they were doing their best. But dang. That really sucks.
Yeah. I'm glad we live in 2023.
Me
Not
too.
1943.
And I have one more reason for that now.
Roll the outro.
Thank you for listening to Soft Serve Science. If you learned something, let us know. You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Soft Serve Science, or email us at softservescience@gmail.com. Stay frosty.